Hey everybody, I'm Amanda, and this is a special road trip edition of New York's Darkside. If you're watching this on YouTube, you may notice I'm not in my usual recording location. I'm actually recording this episode live. Well, not live, but I'm recording this episode from the Tonopah, Nevada World-Famous Clown Motel. Today I have a true crime story that starts in New York and ends in Tonopah, and I found it completely on accident. This is the story of Bina Verrault and the Love Syndicate of New York. This one was so much fun to research. I had to dig through a bunch of early 1900 newspapers, which is such a joy I never knew that I was gonna have. But I found it, and there are some really interesting stories in early old-timey newspapers, like things that would never make the news now made the news back then. This story is just really wild. I'm going to do my best with it because some of the sources had the same story, but they had like the names a little bit different. They had different dates. So as always, I'm going to have all my source material listed in the show notes and on the website for this episode, and let's dive right in. So our story is going to start out somewhere around August 14th, 1906. I say somewhere because a couple of the sources had different dates listed, but anyway, we're starting out at United States District Attorney Francis J. Carmody's office. And he had a real conundrum on his hands. Multiple men had come forward with an incredible story. Among the men were James C. McClellan of Philadelphia, Count Gregory Zelenoff, and Leo Kessler, both of New York. The men claimed that they had been duped out of large amounts of money by a woman using different names, whose identity was truly Bina Verrault. James McClellan claimed that he had been courting the stunning Mrs. Helen Hamilton, a very lonely and very wealthy widow. She had promised to marry him, but after he showered her with gifts and provided her with funds totaling over $2,800, a sum of almost $95,000 in 2023, she just left him and stopped responding to him. Leo Kessler had a similar story, having been duped out of $4,500, or what would equate to $150,000 today, by Mrs. Verrault, who had initially used the alias Mrs. Montgomery with him when she answered his advertisement in the personals. Count Gregory Zelenoff had also been engaged to Mrs. Helen Hamilton. I wasn't able to find out much on him, but I suspect based on some of the third-party information that he was found to not truly be a count, but was actually a grocer. And there were many other men also waiting outside Carmody's office, all with stories of being duped by various means. Many of them, for obvious reasons, did not want their identities released to the public. For the moment, Mrs. Bina Verrault had been arrested, and then she had been released on her own recognizance for the swindling of just McClellan. But who was this beautiful and cunning vixen that had taken advantage of so many men? When the story first broke in the newspapers, no one really knew the answer to that except for Bina and perhaps those most closely associated with her. But on August 14th, 1906, a pair of men would enter the offices of District Attorney Carmody to help solve some of this mystery. One of those men was George T. Verrault. He was a local artist and notably also the husband of Mrs. Bina Verrault. He was not actually dead. She was not actually a widow. He had been living in Bensonhurst, which was a suburb of Brooklyn, and between him and the unnamed man with him, who knew Bina from when she was younger, they had a story to tell about Bina which would help solve the mystery of this enigmatic woman. Bina Verrault was born Bina Finnegan in Ironton, Wisconsin, somewhere between 1871 and 1874. The men didn't seem to know for sure. Her parents were both deeply into alcohol. Her father was, in one source, mentioned to be a Creole sheep farmer. And one night when Bina was young, while at a saloon, which was not at all out of character for him, he got into a drunken brawl and he lost his life. Bina's mother continued to drink, and when Bina was 12, her mother also passed away after a drunken spree. After this, Bina took residence with the family of a banker named George Thompson Morse, who lived in Reedsburg, Wisconsin. She continued her schooling, and one source said that she also worked as a nurse to Mr. Morse's 2 young children. Bina had 2 brothers. It's unclear if she maintained any contact with them throughout the years, but Edward Finnegan, he was working as a schoolmaster in Ironton, and William was working for a railroad in Chicago, according to one source that I read at the time that all of this is going down. At some point in her teenage years, she was being described as a rare beauty. Bina Finnegan moved to Chicago, where she got a job working at a Prussian life insurance company. She reportedly grew bored of the name Bina Finnegan, and she changed it to Bina Forrester. In 1892, Bina made the acquaintance of Mrs. Izella Brown, a widow. The two became fast friends. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and talk to you a little bit about Izella. Izella Wallina Mason was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was one of 11 children. She was said to be a beautiful woman with blonde hair and hazel eyes. She would run off with a topographical engineer 20 years her senior named James Pemberton Brown in 1886. Izella, in my opinion, would prove to be Bina's downfall. She had a very negative influence on Bina. Izella, as it turns out at this time, was only posing as a widow, and her husband was still very much alive. Sound familiar? Izella and Bina would start to stir up trouble for themselves in Chicago, spending quite a bit of their time drinking and shoplifting. They were arrested at least once, and once the police really started to get hot on their trail, the women ended up moving to Philadelphia. I don't have an exact date of that move. At a boarding house in Philadelphia in January of 1901, Bina would meet George T. Verrault. For him, it was love at first sight. George bailed her out, and Bina disappeared for 3 days, because that's apparently what you do when your husband bails you out of jail. I wasn't able to find out any information about what she was doing in that time frame, but when she returned, she started hanging out with Izella again. And she continued drinking heavily, and it was just not good news. George also started to hear from their neighbors that while he was gone, young men were calling on the apartment. George, seeing that this was not going anyplace good, packed up Bina and they moved to Baltimore, Maryland, leaving Izella behind in the Philadelphia apartment. And at some point, they would eventually move to New York City. At this point, Bina was also racking up a large amount of debt and continuing to shoplift, and she was also scamming people. Notably, George Verrault said that Bina had acquired tapestries and other goods from a company called H.B. Chafflin & Co., and that totaled about $15,000 in products, which would be about $500,000 today. According to George, he also knew that Bina had swindled about $5,000 from the Metropolitan Street Railway by claiming that she had been crushed between a car and a pillar. I saw 2 different versions of what happened next. One version is that Bina just ended up leaving George. The other version is that George finally got tired of Bina's antics and he left her. Regardless, they separated sometime before 1903. On January 13th of 1903, as George was walking through New York City, he was going down a dark alleyway and he was stopped by a man named Gregory Allen. He knew Gregory. Gregory was an amateur sculptor, so he knew him from the art world. Gregory approached him and took him by the arm and began to tell him how sorry Bina was for all that she had put him through. George told the district attorney that as he began to feel very badly for leaving Bina and that perhaps he should give her another chance, another man that he recognized as Joseph Mason, one of Izella's brothers, came up to them and grabbed his other arm. Now he was basically helpless, and he was being held by these two men, and Bina, Izella, and two other women came out of hiding and began to horsewhip him in the alley. The group continued to beat him until he was finally able to break free and he escaped. And at this point, he decided that he was going to have no further contact with Bina until the story broke in the papers about the Love Syndicate, and he felt like he needed to set things straight. So let's talk about the Love Syndicate. From what I can gather, it sounds like this was actually a plot that was masterminded by Izella, and Bina had really become the face of the Love Syndicate, which is why there was so much focus on her. Izella Brown had been portraying herself as a widow, as I mentioned earlier, when she first met Bina back in 1892. But she also became a widow in actuality when her husband, John Pemberton Brown, died in 1899. He left Izella a fortune in insurance, and she blew through it very quickly, as she had a habit of living well above her means by all her shopping and living in luxury apartments and things like that. So once she had blown through all of her money, she started working as a cloak model, and then she secured a small flat in New York City. One day, while perusing a newspaper personal ads, she stumbled across one listed by a wealthy married Wall Street broker who was looking for a stenographer. And she answered the ad, and before long, she was on good terms with him. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe that means that they were friendly. Maybe that means they were shacking up. I'm not really sure. Anyway, his wife passed away not long after this, cause unknown to me. It wasn't in the source material, but it said that this man then began to wine and dine Izella, begging her to marry him. She declined, but she took all those gifts. She took all that money. She took all those, dining out. And then she moved on to someone else. She began using the personal ads to do similar schemes, finding wealthy men, getting wined and dined, declining their proposals, and moving on to the next one. And eventually she had so many people responding to her ads, it became too much for her, and so she recruited Bina to help her. The women eventually took up residence initially at 114 West 73rd Street, and they would move later on to 343 West 82nd Street. Both houses were said to be spectacularly decorated, likely with items that the women had swindled, been gifted, stolen, or bought on credit to help build the facade that they were going for. Those of extremely wealthy widows. They most certainly did not work alone. According to the source material, some other players in the syndicate included 4 or 5 of Izella's brothers, 2 of whom had spent time in prison in Massachusetts for playing a badger game, which is just extorting somebody for money. They were extorting a farmer in New England. One of the brothers also had been arrested in Boston multiple times for swindling as a spirit medium. This will come up later. There was also information that the brothers had opened a grocery store on Lake Street in Chicago, then sold for cash the stock that they had bought on credit, which led to the arrest of the person that had bought the stock from them for removing stolen property. Izella's sister, Sarah Mason, Izella's daughter Lillian, and her niece Mary Mason, as well as Gregory Allen, the amateur sculptor I talked about earlier, and an actor named Robert Emmett Keene, who actually ended up quitting his acting career on Broadway because the syndicate was pulling in so much money from their schemes. All were involved in this Love Syndicate. Gregory Allen and Robert Keene would act as butlers for the home. Lillian and Mary, they would act as maids, and Sarah was involved in some form or another. I can't really remember what her deal was. Bina and Izella used multiple different methods to gain money from their victims. They used multiple different aliases. One ruse that they liked to use was they would invite wealthy businessmen to their elaborately decorated home where they would wine and dine them. They would do a couple different things here. One popular method that they would use was that Bina, while they were talking about things, would claim that she was a spiritual medium and that the spirits of the man's loved one, like maybe his grandmother, was contacting her and telling him through her that they wanted him to invest in a company called Kentucky Coal and Fuel. This was a fictitious company that was made up by George Mason, one of Izella's brothers. George was so invested in this company that he had even drawn up papers for the company and included his father-in-law, unbeknownst to him, as the vice president of the company on paper, and he was none too happy when he found out about that. Another common ruse that they would use is they would send invitations to more potentially wealthy investors, inviting them to dinner parties that claimed that then Secretary Root, Secretary Taft, and Governor Stokes of New Jersey would be present at these dinner parties. And then George Mason would leave before or during the dinner and would send telegrams to the home after the guests had arrived, claiming that something had come up and those guests were no longer coming. Another scam that the women used was placing or answering ads in the personals under the guise of being wealthy widows looking to marry. And this is, again, how our three gentlemen from the beginning of the story became ensnared in the Love Syndicate. Leo Kessler, age 40 at the time of the events, was described as a tall and auburn-haired man who had been in love only once, and that was with dear Bina. Leo was interviewed in one of the articles that I read. He would tell the reporter that he had only come forward after Joseph McClellan had, and the story that he gave was that he had advertised for a wife in October of 1905 as he was feeling very lonely, he'd never been in love, and he had no one to make love to. He had gotten some replies to his advertisement, and among them was one signed Mrs. Montgomery. Ooh la la. He really liked the way the letter read, so he called to the home of 114 West 73rd Street, where Bina was living before moving to 82nd Street. An elegantly dressed butler answered the door, and he found the home to be, quote, the finest house he had ever been in, end quote. Izella Brown greeted him, and she introduced herself as Bina's sister-in-law, and after calling on Bina for about a week, she started to tell him that her assets were all tied up in litigation. So, ever being the good gentleman, he started to give her money to help her push things along so that it would get done quicker. He took her out. He took her all around town. He bought her an engagement ring. And whenever he took her out, she would wear a veil, claiming that if her brother saw her out on the town, he would be angry because she was with a stranger. Leo ended up giving Bina so much money that he had to borrow money to keep giving her it. When she asked for a particularly large sum of money one day, the amount undisclosed in the source material, he finally had to refuse, and then she stopped writing to him. So instead, he got a letter from Izella claiming that Bina had gone west. Just before George had come to the office of the district attorney, a second warrant was placed for Bina Verrault's arrest. Now remember, she had already been arrested for Joe McClellan and had been released for her on her own recognizance. This warrant is for Leo Kessler. The U.S. Marshals went to the home of 343 West 82nd Street and called on the door while George was still speaking with the district attorney. The door was answered by a young man, but was not one of the usual butlers. When the marshals requested to speak with Bina Verrault, they were told that the young man that the family had gone to the country and were not home. The men started to leave, but they heard a female voice from the door, they heard a female voice from the door as it was closing, telling the young man that he had fooled them. The U.S. Marshals, not to be had, turned around and pushed into the house and found that the home appeared to have been emptied of a lot of the personal belongings. Bina Verrault was not inside. The U.S. Marshals then called upon Bina's lawyers, who told them that she would present to the federal building by 3 p.m., but she failed to show. And at this point, they believed that she had fled. George Verrault's testimony, however, cinched the case against Bina, and he, at this point, confirmed that she was using the mail as part of her schemes. Bina actually hadn't fled. She would come later with her lawyers and Izella in tow to the federal building. They had a preliminary hearing, and then the court agreed that they would postpone the hearing until September 26th to give them time to prepare and to have as many of the men testify as possible. They wanted to hear it all. In the interim, an article in the Boston Globe on August 28, 1906 would proclaim that Bina was being charged with another count of swindling when several men from New York and Boston would claim that they had responded to ads in the newspaper telling of rich lead fields discovered in Newfoundland. The address given was the Kentucky Fuel and Alcohol Company, run by the Love Syndicate, who had an address for an office at 58 Wall Street. When the gentlemen would go to that address, they were referred to a Mrs. Maria Mason at 114 West 73rd Street. The men would be shown dispatches from Newfoundland with descriptions of the land surveys of the mining properties, and they would be so taken with this that they would buy large quantities of stock with the money given directly to Mrs. Mason. The buyers of this stock recognized Bina Verrault, her photo in the paper, as being Mrs. Maria C. Mason when stories started running about the Love Syndicate bust. They also realized at this time that the telegrams with the land surveys had actually been sent by George C. Mason. There was potentially yet another swindling scheme that had offices at 52 Broadway that listed George C. Mason as president, and there were concerns that Verrault and Brown were prospering from that scheme as well. Bina would end up going to court in September of 1906, where she would give testimony, and she would state, quote, "I have been abused and grossly misrepresented." Quote, "I have been abused and grossly misrepresented." Wow. Bina would end up going to court in September of 1906, where she would give testimony stating, "I have been abused and grossly misrepresented on all sides. My character has been wantonly assailed, and I have been pictured before the public as an adventuress whose one aim was to wring cash from unsuspecting men." She would claim that the truth was the men were actually trying to scheme her from her worldly possessions by pretending to make love to her. She then would go on to say that the truth was she should be seen as an example for women, since she had shown them the dangers of meeting men through newspaper ads. She stated that she could out many high-profile men who had called on her, but she didn't want to sully their names without grave consideration. Bina would also claim that a German baron was hounding her, trying to get letters back that he had written to her because he had given her jewelry that didn't actually belong to him, and He actually wanted to marry her so that he could get money from her while they were married to pay for the jewelry, and he was worried that she was going to publish the letters that he had given her as proof. All told, Bina and Izella are thought to have swindled about $100,000 from the men they trapped in their syndicate, an equivalent of about $3.4 million in 2023. Bina would end up selling some diamond rings during the trial, and this time she did flee, and she moved to Tonopah, Nevada, before the trial was over. She went by her alias, Helen Hamilton, and she arrived with several of her fine gowns and little else. The people of Tonopah had never heard of her, so she was relatively safe here. She started working as a prospector in the mines, which she was reportedly terrible at, and set to work at her old ways, trying to swindle men around Tonopah. There were several men that would report being engaged to her, but she was, again, up to her old ways and would dump one for the next. Bina would end up being shunned eventually by the men and lived rather lonely. The reason, quote unquote, unknown, but likely because they caught on to her mischievous and deceitful ways. She took refuge in a strong drink and could often be found at the theater and in the bars. The excessive alcohol use seemed to take a toll on Bina. It was reported that she was no longer, quote, the woman with fine appearances who had dazzled the camp when she arrived, end quote. She would fall ill eventually and die in a delirium due to heart failure and excessive alcohol use. And despite the physician's attempt to help her, she passed away. Her death was so sudden, though, that it did become a coroner's case, but it was determined that her death was due to the excessive alcoholism. The townsfolk of Tonopah would put together a fund and bury her in Tonopah Cemetery, where she remains today. I actually got to go visit her grave. Her effects were turned over to a special administrator named J.P. Bristle, and everyone kind of went on about their lives in Tonopah, but Bristle, he was able to track down that the mysterious Helen Hamilton was truly Bina Verrault. So Bina's grave, like I said, is here at the Tonopah Cemetery, which is right next to the world-famous Clown Motel, where I am recording this episode. Bina is said to haunt the visitors center at the historic Tonopah Mining Park, which is basically right across the street from the hotel. I don't know why I'm pointing, you can't see it. I am just so excited that I stumbled across this case. I had mentioned a while ago, like a year or two ago, to my dad, who I'm on this road trip with, that I wanted to visit this clown motel, and that was well before I made the decision to start this podcast. And as I was looking up the motel after he booked the rooms, I saw the cemetery, and then as I was reading through that, I found this case. So it was like meant to be, I guess. So anyway, in case anyone is interested, and the room I'm staying at is room 214, which is the Friday the 13th room. I have a scary painting of Jason Voorhees to keep me company tonight, as well as several other clown paintings in the room. I have already put some of those pictures up on social media. If you haven't seen those already, be sure to check that out. Again, have the video version of this episode on YouTube, so you can see me recording there. Hopefully no equipment went haywire while I was recording. I didn't notice anything, but like I said, this room is supposedly haunted. I'll definitely be giving an update in the next episode if I do experience any hauntings tonight. We're going to check out the cemetery after dark. I've already been over there once. There's reports that the lights in here turn on and off on their own. Maybe they did behind me. I didn't notice anything. But I haven't really been in here very long, and maybe it only happens after dark. So we'll see how the night progresses. Anyway, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure that if you haven't already, you follow the show on your podcast platform of choice so you get the most up-to-date info on when new episodes drop. You can also follow the show on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you want, you can send me an email at nydarksidepodcast@gmail.com. All episode information can be found on my website as well, www.nydarksidepodcast.com. I hope you keep listening, and most of all, I hope you stay spooky and curious.